Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. The degree in romance, language, and literature was probably not the most practical that I could have chosen, but in some ways I feel like it chose me. I really, really am happy when my brain is engaged with any sort of world language. We're not supposed to say foreign language anymore. We say world language. For some reason, my brain is particularly happy when it is engaged with French. I don't have a lot of chances to speak French, and my reading French is definitely better than my spoken French, but I really love the opportunity to dig in to any kind of French fiction. That is why, in part, we are reading today The Mystery Guest by Gregoire Bouillier. So part of the reason why we are reading it and why I was drawn to it is, in fact, this incredible edition by McNally Jackson. That is an imprint out of New York that is kind of resurrecting some titles that maybe made a big splash back in the day and need to be sort of lifted back into the conversation, or ones that perhaps didn't quite get their due. The original of this book was published in 2004 by Gregoire Bouillier, and it was translated into English at that point. And in fact, I was drawn to it and the idea of reading it in French because, in fact, it is very short. It is, in fact, only 91 pages long, so anyone out there who wants to dust off their French, this would be a good one to read the English and the French side by side. So I was attracted to the book because I really trust McNally Jackson, also because of its length. I also really love the cover. What we have here is sort of a gray ground and then the mark that a wine bottle would have left. So that explains why, in fact, I am coming to you from a wine cellar. You will notice if you were on the YouTube that there are not very many bottles of wine in the wine cellar. This wine cellar came with our house, but we are the kind of people who buy, a few bottles of wine and we drink them. We are certainly not collectors. I think I have like a very cheap, Sauvignon Blanc up here, and maybe it's probably Miraval. Wow, all that stuff with Brad Pitt and his children. Whew. So I am coming to you because, in fact, one of the main sort of plot points of this book has to do with a very, very nice bottle of wine. And I really was drawn, to this image on the front of the cover. It's also a little bit like the coffee ring that we have as our logo here at the Foxed Page. The fact that I am in the cellar also may explain for some of you why the audio is a little wacky. I really wanted to talk about this book, and they're doing all week long some sort of road construction in front of our house, and it is so loud that I am hiding out. For those of you who like an agenda, we are first going to talk about autofiction. We're then going to do a very, very brief bio of Gregoire Bouillier, and then we're going to dive into the text. We're then going to talk about some literary parallels. This book really rests in some ways on Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, which you can imagine how much I love that. Then we are going to move on to talk about the language, that is the way it's sort of generally used in this work, and then also about the translation. So this is the second translation, and I will tell you right now, I did not find it the best. So I really want to love every single thing that McNally Jackson, presents to me as an opportunity. But I did, even before I had read the French or read the other translation, which also came out in 2004, I was a little suspicious. And we're going to get to that. But it was one of the elements that, was not quite as satisfying as some of the other elements of this novella. We have talked about autofiction before here at the Foxed Page. Autofiction, I think of it as a very French thing because the French don't seem to have quite as much of an issue that we Americans do of sort of really, really marking that line between fact and fiction. So there's this whole body of work, a lot of it in French, but also in other places, where you can have an autobiography that is in fact very novelistic. So there are a few things that mark this kind of fiction. One is that you will usually have a first-person narrator, and if the protagonist is named, that person will have the same name as the author. You also have a lot of novelistic conventions. You might have a memoir that sort of covers the whole entire life of someone. Autofiction tends to have more novelistic shape to it in the sense that it might focus on a certain period of time, or in this case, on a certain incident. This guy who's trying to get over a breakup and goes to a party. A lot of autofiction, too, is sort of touted as a way for different writers to come to grips with who they are. There is oftentimes kind of like a Bildungsroman kind of feeling, like someone coming of age, or the idea of navigating a very difficult time. So again, it wouldn't be something where you would have, the entire childhood the way you do with, say, Mary Karr, for example, where really the guiding force is just sort of chronology. Here we have, in fact, more of a novelistic arc. The other thing that happens when you have autofiction that is not designated as true, you could have entire subplots that are made up. Their entire, you could have an entire character, you could have interactions and things that are not, in fact, true. So I know for some people, this is really unappealing and is maybe making you very uncomfortable, but I really don't have a problem with it, in part because I am not sure, how true any kind of memoir is. So when someone is writing about themselves in any kind of great detail, and a lot of memoirs seek to feel like a novel, certainly something like Mary Karr does, or The Glass Castle, or all the Cheryl Strayed books, those really read like novels. I mean, they aren't newspaper articles, and they aren't sort of journalism where you have the language that is very stripped down. In fact, here we have scenes and we have details that feel very novelistic. But in some of those cases, I do wonder kind of what is true. Certainly when an author is talking about their childhood, if you have entire scenes and details, part of me is like, wait, how is it that you can remember all of that? And maybe, in fact, these people have that kind of memory and are able to do that. But my sense is that it's a little suspect. I also really like the idea of reading something that feels like a novel, but understanding that the person who is writing it is really, may be, a lot of these things may be real. So, and I also really love it when any kind of real life stuff, makes an incursion into the novel. So in this case, we have Sophie Calle, who is a very important French performance artist. I did not know that before I started the book. But when she makes her entrances at different times into the book, it's very exciting because you sort of have this sense of like the real world as being very available to you and being sort of shown to you in a different way because it is a different author who is telling you about themselves. Examples of this, one of the big ones is Karl Ove Knausgaard, who's a Norwegian. Yeah, I think he's Norwegian. And he wrote like a 36,000 page, no, 3,600, I think. That sounds more in the ballpark. Actually, don't quote me on how long it is, but it's like a 6-volume thing called My Struggle, which talks about his childhood, his adolescence, his marriage, all sorts of different stuff. And it is not, it is not categorized one way or the other. It is not a novel, and it is not, in fact, a memoir. And nobody seems really very bothered by that. We do have some examples of American situations. Bret Easton Ellis, when like Less Than Zero really did feel in lots of ways autobiographical. That felt like sort of an auto-fiction kind of book. We also have an older example in Truman Capote in Cold Blood. So he, in fact, called his writing faction. In fact, a mixture of fact and fiction. And you do, I think everybody knows that it's kind of this, novelistic portrayal of an actual crime that occurred. And nobody seems to be too bothered by, sort of parsing which of those facts are real, partially because the writing is so good and the details are not super consequential. So maybe that's one way to think about autofiction. It's not like you're reading a manual or, like the newspaper. You're reading something where the information, the sort of facts, the nuts and bolts are not the most important part. That's another very important piece of this puzzle. And it's another reason why it doesn't really bother me, because I am not, in fact, trying to glean actual information that I need to, in fact, be true. Again, there are a lot of French writers who write like this. One of them is Annie Ernaux. If you're looking for short French work to read, side by side with your English, Annie Ernaux is excellent because of her stripped down prose. It's so engaging and so incredibly, just sort of engrossing and so interesting. But the prose is, it's not like Flaubert where you have to know what like a bibelot is, or you have to know what a certain carriage looks like. It's still very rich in many ways, but it's kind of stripped down prose that's easier for someone, who's reading French is not perhaps maybe what it used to be. Okay, so Gregoire Bouillier, I actually know very little about him. He was born in 1960 in Algiers, but grew up in France. He, in fact, did have a relationship with Sophie Calle, and very famously, she had a piece of art that was shown at the Venice Biennale, like a very big deal, that was inspired by a note that he left for her when they ended their relationship. And the last part was take care of yourself, which I think she found a little cold and a little inadequate given their relationship. And so she did a lot of work with other women and this phrase. For those of you on YouTube, I will take a look at it and post some images. He wrote a book that was very popular that came out in 2002 in France called Report on Myself. Then he wrote L'invité mystère in 2004. And then we have this long break. And in 2024, he came out with this monster book called Le cœur ne cède pas. And I can't give you the English translation of that title because, in fact, it doesn't exist. I heard about this great, short novel by Gregoire Bouillier, and I actually ordered it online, and I didn't know the title of it. I didn't really think that was important. And I, in fact, got the 900-page book, and I was like, wait a minute, this is not the novella that I was ready to dive into. I am not sure if I'm ever going to read Le cœur ne cède pas, but you never know. We're going to go ahead and dive now into the book. I like the title so much. The mystery guest, it's very straightforward. And in French, it is l'invité mystère. So it's very close to the French. And I really like the way that it is really foregrounding the idea of mystery. And in many ways, it's not super mysterious who this guy is, but it comes from this idea that Sophie Calle, every year when she has her birthday, she invites the same number of people as the year, as the number she is turning, and then she invites this mystery guest. So the premise of this book is at the very beginning, our author / narrator gets a phone call from a woman who he is desperately trying to get over, someone who he'd had a horrible breakup with not actually a few years before, and she's finally calling him back. And he is assuming maybe that they will get back together when in fact she is calling to invite him to be the Sophie Calle mystery guest. But you do have this sense of being sort of drawn in by the mystery of the title. It's also very important that we have here a true story. So again, this gets back to that whole American thing about really wanting to know when things are true and when they are not true. But I will say, when something says a true story and it looks very literary, like a novel, and it's, being brought out by McNally Jackson, you've got me. Because, I would have to make sure that I actually was interested in the story a little bit. But there is something about, something being true that draws you in. But again, I'm not interested. I don't even really read very much memoir because the fact of something being true is far less important to me than the experience of being in that language for a certain amount of time. When the book was translated in 2004 by Lauren Stein, it's very shiny. It came with the subtitle An Account. So it is The Mystery Guest, An Account. And I like both of those. A true story to me seems like a little bit bold, but it certainly does grab you. I also really like the cover of this. We've got just, the standard and very appealing way that McNally Jackson always does their title. And then we have this very neutral but very appealing grayish kind of background. And on it, we have this, this ring that looks like the bottom of a wine bottle. The irony is, of course, that the mystery guest brings this very expensive bottle of wine to the party and then realizes, in fact, that Sophie Calle is a woman who not only does she have a mystery guest at her birthday parties, but she saves all of her birthday gifts and uses them in a piece of contemporary performance art. We are now going to go ahead and open up the book. I also enjoy the fact that the French flaps, I'm a sucker for the French flaps. And in fact, McNally Jackson does such a beautiful job with the color of these French flaps. It's a very wine-colored, interior of this book, which is very appealing. So then we have a whole slew of these blurbs, but it's very important to recognize that these blurbs were for the other translation. They are for the 2004 translation, which to me felt like a bit of a cheat. And again, I want to love everything that McNally Jackson puts out, but that did feel like a bit of a cheat. If you are someone who is sensitive to translation and, who's reading things in translation and trying to sort of, reverse engineer certain phrases that might sound a little awkward, the translation is very important. So the idea of all of this laudatory stuff at the beginning is not about this translation. It is very important to note that the dedication of the book is to Sophie Calle. So he dedicated that to her, and she, in fact, dedicated one of her works to him, which I really enjoyed the idea that this person in this slim volume that feels very novelistic to me is, in fact, someone who is real. So it does bring up this question, though, which I kind of, wrestle with, which is that there are lots of ways that this book feels a little opaque because, in fact, we don't know who Sophie, maybe you do. A lot of people maybe do. I did not, in fact, know who Sophie Calle was. I also did not know anything about Gregoire Bouillier. I did not know that they had a relationship. I also didn't know who Michel Leiris was. He's a surrealist writer who we meet right at the beginning. So I will look these things up, obviously, but it sort of takes you a bit out of the work in a way that's not great. And it does leave you with this question of sort of like, how much responsibility does the translation have? And in fact, the answer is zero. Like, the translator doesn't need to be pointing out all of the different, people and giving you biographies unless they come out with like an annotated version of this. Oddly, there is a time at the end when Ben Truman, who is the translator of this, points out like the name of a singer that he is quoting, our narrator is quoting, which seems like kind of an odd time. There were other times where it felt much more important to understand who these people were, but perhaps the translator, maybe he's French and maybe he in fact knew all of these people so well that they did not, need any kind of, annotation. We are now going to dive into the text. I'm going to read the first paragraph. It was the day Michel Leiris died. This would have been late September 1990, or else very early October. The date escapes me, but never mind. I can always look it up later on. In any case, it was a Sunday, because I was at home in the middle of the afternoon, and it was unseasonably cold out, and I'd gone to sleep in my clothes, wrapped up in a blanket the way I often did when I found myself alone. In those days, cold and oblivion were all I wanted. This was fine with me. One day I knew it would be time to rejoin the living, and that day could wait. I'd seen enough. Beings, things, landscapes. I had enough to ruminate on for the next century or two. That was plenty. I didn't want more trouble. Okay, so a couple of quick things here. So we are beginning with the death of Michel Leiris. It's a very big deal for him. It's really sort of grounding the entire novella. And what's important about this is that Michel, there are many things that are important, but one element is that Michel Leiris was he was a very important surrealist French writer. And the fact that he is dying at the beginning of the book, and it comes up again and again, it's important to focus on the surrealism. But also, as we have the death of the one writer and sort of the beginning of the career of the other, you can see the ways in which perhaps our narrator is wanting to have sort of a passing of the baton. Then we have him going into some specifics about dates and times. Again, this is really grounding us in some ways in his world. And it is also, again, resonant with this idea of wanting to figure out who you are, as sort of this autofiction as being a way to explore who it is that you are. And here again, in terms of autofiction, and because of the title of the English version having a true story, we have this idea that it is not, in fact, a novella, and we have this idea that we should be reading this as memoir, when in fact, in the French, it's not really specified one way or the other. We conflate the author and the narrator in lots of ways, and we have this sense that Gregoire Bouillier is talking about himself, but we have a lot of novelistic elements that make it feel like a novella. So this idea of beginning the novel with a well-known French writer, this surrealist writer, carries on in the sense that we have lots of literary references throughout the book. And I just want to point out a couple. One is a very subtle one, but I think very important on page 24. I was berating myself for being an idiot, for being crazy. No, for being an idiot. And I was consumed with self-mockery. I was just a dime store Don Quixote looking for trouble, and trouble was what I'd find. So this reference here to Don Quixote is important in many ways. First of all, he's invoking Cervantes, who is, some people believe that Don Quixote, published in 1604, 1605, is literally the first novel. And it's a very complex novel because we have kind of an unreliable narrator. But here we have him just really evoking the idea of Don Quixote. And it's important to remember that Don Quixote is sort of emblematic of like having your head in the clouds and having a very rich fantasy life. And in fact, Don Quixote is in love with Dulcinea, who's like a kind of a just a normal peasant woman, but he sees her as this incredible princess who's very beautiful, and in his mind he has really built her up. So I think we are being invited here to really believe that our narrator, who is also essentially Gregoire Bouillier, we have this idea of him as building up these romantic attachments that he has with different women and really investing a lot of fantasy in them, whether or not they're actually going to meet his expectations. We also have a number of different references to Ulysses. So some of them are to Odysseus, Ulysses and Odysseus being the same thing. But we have, if you can hear that click, click, clicking, that is a dog who is so nervous that I don't know why he's so nervous. Maybe it's all the road work, that I didn't have the heart to put him outside, plus he'll scratch. So apologies for the click, click, clicking of the very old dog. Back to Ulysses. So Odysseus, otherwise known as Ulysses, is this wanderer who is on this quest, very much like we have our wanderer on his quest here to sort of get back together with his ex-girlfriend, or at least to show up at this party and be the kind of superlative mystery guest. So we have this idea of Odysseus, and he laments in here that like at least Odysseus had his son with him, and in this case, he's by himself. We also, again, have a woman in relationship to Odysseus or Ulysses, which is Penelope. So we have this idea of Penelope as being back on their home island and in fact being courted by all of these other people, and Odysseus trying to get back to her. So again, we have this huge literary icon who is really in many ways known for having this kind of important love that the story in many ways sort of turns around. So we have these kind of heavy-duty references to literary greats. He mentions self-mockery here. In many ways, I think he's bringing out these literary giants, in part to realize sort of what, in his 91 pages, that he is nothing like, Cervantes or Homer. And he also brings up two other Ulysses. So one is this little space probe that's a French space probe that's going to check out the sun, which I was a little like, I don't think you can land on the sun. Maybe it's like just taking pictures and making readings and whatnot. So that is Ulysses. It's traveling far away and coming back home. And then we also have Ulysses as the James Joyce modernist classic. So in that, again, you have like an everyday man who is having a quest during a period of one day, and is very much like the Ulysses character in the Odyssey, but in fact is kind of an Irish everyman. So we have this modernist masterpiece in Ulysses, and it sort of dovetails nicely with another modernist masterpiece, which is, of course, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. So Virginia Woolf is one of my very favorite writers, and I was so happy when I got to the end of this and realized that Mrs. Dalloway is very much like a controlling idea, and that it maps very neatly in some ways onto the mystery guest. Most of you, I think, are familiar with Mrs. Dalloway. At the very beginning, Clarissa is, she's preparing for a party at her home, and she is going to go out and buy some flowers. So very much like the Odyssey, she makes her way out and around London and then comes back to her home. But she is also very closely aligned with both her husband, Richard Dalloway, but also with Peter Walsh. And Peter Walsh was sort of like, an earlier love in Clarissa Dalloway's life, and really would have, meant that she lived an entirely different life than she did with Richard Dalloway. But Peter Walsh ends up being this very important figure of regret and possibility and sort of the road not taken. So again, in many ways, we have this Gregoire Bouillier character here who is looking at exactly the same sort of thing. He has broken up with this woman several years before. He's trying to get over her. And you have this sense of him as being a very much like Peter Walsh in that he would have liked to have been with this woman, much like Peter Walsh would have liked to have been with Clarissa Dalloway. And, this sort of unrealized love and this unrealized future. Predictably, I loved the parts of the novella where Mrs. Dalloway and Virginia Woolf really, come to the fore, where he's very upfront about the ways that Mrs. Dalloway is, in fact, coloring his experience of life, essentially. So I want to read a couple of those excerpts. And he really is seeing Mrs. Dalloway as kind of determining his fate. He goes back to his place and he finds a copy and reads it and realizes how clearly it maps onto his experience. Also, he is talking here about his old flame who he had broken up with. Because the entire book made it clear that it wasn't her who called to invite me to that party. It was Mrs. Dalloway, or rather the spirit of Mrs. Dalloway, which had possessed her just as the spirit of Ulysses stuck with me after she left. Starting then, yes, I wasn't the only one who had experienced such bizarre sublimations or even total metamorphoses. It happened to other people too, starting with her, and it was both scary and amazing, and it all fit together too neatly not to be true. And then a little further down, who owned my reality? I was a human being too in my way, and when I looked at these events through the lens of Woolf's novel, I was finally able to believe and to hope that they'd happen for a reason, and that this reason was accessible to me. Yes, all of a sudden, they no longer struck me as absurd and chaotic and disastrous, but rather as logical and inspired and life-saving. As I saw one page after another transported into reality, and saw how wonderfully, given the means at her disposal and how little she had to work with, she had tailored Woolf's novel to her own life. So I think there are ways where I can look at this and be excited that Mrs. Dalloway is showing up in the novel, but it's very important to take it one step further and ask ourselves, so what? Why is it important that he is making all of these literary references? And one of the ways that we can think about this is that throughout the entire novella, he's really searching for sense. He's really trying to make sense of his life and the things that have happened to him and the things that are out of his control and in his control. And there's a lot here about time and fate and, love and unrequited love and disastrous love. So we have all of these large questions that are often the questions of literature. So you have this sense of this, slim 91 pages as really showing us how in the modern day, all of these major preoccupations that we have seen, for centuries, and that we saw in Don Quixote, and that we saw again, well, first we saw them in the Odyssey, and then Don Quixote, and then in Mrs. Dalloway. So you have this beautiful sort of idea that each one of us in our kind of normal lives with our normal problems and our kind of everyday preoccupations really are also on some level grappling with these very large issues. There's also the idea that our narrator is looking for patterns and he's looking for ways to reframe what is happening to him and to sort of understand it more fully. And these patterns that he sees in literature are very helpful in terms of understanding how things are going to go, like what it means. So instead of just thinking that he was totally rejected by, his former love, which may have been the case, he can sort of think to himself that maybe he is in fact like the Peter Walsh character in Mrs. Dalloway, and that in fact she had very deep feelings for him. It just simply didn't work out. So all of these literary echoes are a very good segue into the idea of language and sort of language in general in the novel. In some ways, the way that the prose reads is really interesting. It reads almost more like a diary or a journal than it does like a story that is being told to someone else. And I think in some ways, he's really playing with how narcissistic it feels and how sort of self-absorbed it feels. But at times, I must say that it felt like a little too narcissistic for me, a little too self-absorbed. I was like, oh my gosh. I mean, I think a lot of it was meant to be funny, but some of it actually did not feel that funny and felt a little more just, frankly, kind of annoying. But again, I believe part of that is because of the translation. But the reason why it has this feel in large part is because you have these long sentences, and often the punctuation in the English version will have question marks and it will have periods, where in the French version we have a lot of semicolons. So the sentences seem even longer in the French version, and we have a lot of digressions. So it's sort of like stream of consciousness in the sense, not really in the sense of Virginia Woolf, but like in the sense of like something, occurs to him and he's sort of off on a tangent in a way that I found very interesting. But again, it feels very much like something that he is writing for himself. It's almost like we're invited into his mind. And actually, that's quite a bit like the Karl Ove Knausgaard in My Struggle. You feel like you are invited into the mind of this person, and they're sort of sharing all of their thoughts with you, not, sort of laying out a more novelistic approach that would have more to do with plot and character development. This is very much interior musings. And one of the things that's really excellent about being in the mind of this person who is in fact really suffering, and these things may be, very self-absorbing to him, but there is a lot of vulnerability. So he's really laying out for us, himself in some ways in like his most raw form and his most vulnerable form. And there's something very appealing about that. It's that old saw in MFA programs where they tell you that, if you want someone to love your characters that you're writing, you should show them all of your characters' vulnerability, not their strengths. That strengths are, more alienating than anything else. And again, unrequited love or dashed hopes, I mean, these are very universal things. So in many ways, we can both relate and also kind of not relate to what is happening with this narrator. Another aspect that was very, remarkable to me in the sort of true sense of that word about the language generally in the book is the use of cliche. So there's lots and lots of use of idiomatic expressions and a lot of cliche, and you can feel that because again and again and again, there are little phrases that say like, as they say, as they say, as you might say, as they say. And it's the same in the French. And it gives you, it sort of tips you off, of course, to this idea that, he's using a cliche and then he's like, as they say. So you have this sense of language as being something that is very familiar and something that is used, like almost a little bit overused in some ways. But also, I think a lot of the cliche stuff is effective here because, first of all, it's a very efficient shorthand. I think sometimes you can tell that a writer is trying to work around a cliche and it just ends up feeling awkward. So you have this idea of this shorthand, but you also have the idea of language as being kind of worn out and as genres being kind of worn out. And this idea of, this fixation on what people say and what these expressions are is this real idea of trying to articulate something that is difficult to articulate and that he himself is trying to make it more familiar. So I think you could argue that the cliches are in some ways his effort to make this understandable, to make sense to himself. In fact, a lot of the cliches end up being uses of figurative language. So figurative language is, metaphor, simile, anytime language is like doing more than just denoting something. And there is a lot of figurative language in the book, some of it more successful than others. So figurative language also poses a real difficulty to translators because oftentimes, an expression using figurative language will be an idiomatic expression in a certain language and it does not translate directly. So we're going to take a look at some of these examples of figurative language. On page 7, we have this. This is at the very beginning of the novel when his ex-girlfriend has called. I wanted her to know, and no, my life hadn't turned into one long hibernation, and it wasn't as if I spent all my time pining away in bed all by myself ever since she'd left. Quite the opposite. My life was one party after another, and I was in top form, and every moment of the day was a tiptoe through the tulips, whatever she may have thought to the contrary. What's interesting to me about this passage, first of all, I was like, how are they translating tiptoe through the tulips? Because that's a little bit of an arcane expression in some ways. It's also like a little bit corny, or like it feels like a different generation in some ways. And it is in French, it has to do with poppies. It's the coquillotte. It's sort of close to the idea of tiptoe through the tulips, that kind of thing. But it doesn't have obviously doesn't have some of the same resonance that one does. And what we have here is this piling up both of figurative language and also of idiomatic expressions. So we have the long hibernation, which is suggesting, a bear and this idea of having to retreat for a long period of time. Also winter and then, growth in spring. But then we have the idea of pining away in bed, which is translated, it's obviously, that's not the expression in French. So there is, this is not a bad translation in my mind, but it is, you have this different, first we have the hibernation, and now we have pining away. And then a little further down, My life was one party after another and I was in top form. So, saying his life was a party, that is a metaphor. And then this tiptoe through the tulips. So there are lots of times where you have this kind of accumulation of figurative language and idiomatic expressions. And I tired of it, frankly, a little bit. But I also think it is somewhat a conscious choice, because I think lots of times that's sort of how we think of things. And also because he is trying to figure out and sort of really understand his reaction, the idea of trying on a bunch of different expressions is maybe a way for him to get closer to some sort of meaning and some sort of understanding. On page 18, we have a few more of this kind of accumulation of figurative language. One point he's talking about his turtlenecks, and he says everyone has their straitjacket. So you have this idea here of insanity, which, at times you're like, I think this might be a clinical situation here, potentially, meaning maybe he's clinically depressed and needs to get out of bed. So this idea of the straitjacket is obviously, pointing to this idea of being insane. Then a little further down, he talks about being a basket case, which is, again, something that doesn't translate particularly well into the French. So we have this kind of accumulation. And then just like he did before, at the end, we have this kind of lifting. He says, I was sailing through life with impunity and felt altogether relaxed, and I'd even met somebody new. So you have this idea at the end, not only of hope because he has met someone new, but this idea of sailing through life. It's very much like a tiptoe through the tulips. So often too, you'll have these kind of desperate idioms and metaphors and different types of figurative language. And then at the end, there's kind of a reversal where suddenly everything is fine. Then we are going to look at the very end of the book on page 74. This is an example of figurative language that's sort of this nice culmination in some ways. And this is an example of symbolism more than it's an example of, a metaphor or a simile, or foreshadowing. And I think this works very well. He's talking about the ex-girlfriend and how she asked him to change the light bulb in the bathroom, and he was putting it off and then finally did it. I jiggled the used-up bulb to hear a little sound of the filament. And only then did I realize that it was really and truly dead. And at that moment, I wasn't thinking about some light bulb. No, all at once I understood that I was able to replace this bulb because the light had come back on in some dark recess of my being. And so now it made sense that there should be light in the bathroom. So it's important too that this is a bathroom. This is a shared space for the two of them, but it's a very intimate space in lots of ways. It has to do, with privacy and being by yourself, most conventionally. But we also have this idea of light. Obviously light is very symbolic. And he even says, he was sort of lighting up a dark part of himself, a dark recess. So I like the idea too of changing the light bulb, of going from darkness to light. So there's a lot of use of figurative language that isn't in fact cliche and that I think works very well. The whole discussion of figurative language actually segues very nicely into the idea of translation, because you can imagine the ways in which idiomatic expressions, metaphors, and similes just wouldn't have the same, especially if they were cliche, wouldn't have the same kind of resonance in English as they did in French. I was very curious about how a lot of that kind of translation was going to happen. The biggest example of the kind of difficulties of translating a French cliche into, or idiomatic expression into English, actually has everything to do with Mrs. Dalloway. So early in the novel, or early in the novella, we have a translation of an idiomatic expression that's very important to be expressed this way, but it so obviously should have been something else that I was like, wait, what? What we have here, he's frustrated because he was just getting over his ex-girlfriend and then she calls. And so what he says here, and our translator leaves this in French, c'est le bouquet. This really is the bouquet. That is an expression that means this takes the cake. So in English, we would say, oh, this takes the cake. But in this case, he just leaves it at that, and there is no explanation. So really beautifully in the other edition here, because that is such an important point, so the bouquet is very resonant of Mrs. Dalloway. The way that this translator, Lauren Stein, handled it was with a short translator's note, very brief, at the beginning of the novella, and he says this: for reasons the reader will understand, I have refrained from translating the expression c'est le bouquet. It means more or less, that takes the cake. So I thought that was a much more elegant way to go about translating this instead of just leaving it, because part of me was like, wait, like the expression is this takes the cake, and it's very obvious from the context, and having some French and knowing that c'est le bouquet would mean this is the bouquet. Also, it's the same word in English, so I think everybody would know that. Like this is the bouquet means this takes the cake. The bouquet becomes very important because at the end, when he sees this bouquet of roses, it reminds him of the flowers that Mrs. Dalloway has purchased in her book. And so it is this very important plot point, but I think it was much more elegantly handled by Lauren Stein. So what's odd in some ways is that we have this kind of translation here, but then but then in a couple of other places, we have a footnote on the part of our translator, Ben Truman, where it's a much less important idiomatic expression or piece of figurative language, and yet we have this footnote that pulls us out, and in fact, often it has to do with a pun that isn't very well translated. And we're not going to go into that too deeply, but it seemed so strange to me because when we really needed a note, and just to explain it quickly, we don't have it. But then later, at what seemed to me slightly random times, he would have something to the effect that, this is an untranslatable pun, and he would explain it. But I also think that when you are translating, as with anything in fiction, you don't want to draw your reader out of the narration. And it definitely draws you out of the narration to have him say, oh, this is an untranslatable pun. Here is what it is in French. And then you're kind of looking back and forth and you're doing the translation yourself. And you're totally outside then of the text. And what Lauren Stein does instead is he makes sort of his best approximation, an untranslatable pun. And, it's not actually even awkward because I think Lauren Stein did a very good job translating this. So you have just a different construction in English. And sometimes it's obviously not the same pun that it would be in French, but he just kind of lets it go. Another issue I had with the translation was word choice. So the first one is this idea of the bouquet and takes the cake. And again, I think that would have been handled better with a note. But we also have a couple of other big word choice issues. So one is when he starts talking about the turtleneck undershirts. In English, the way I think of an undershirt is like either a tank top undershirt, one of those ribbed ones, or like a plain white Hanes t-shirt that you would wear underneath a dress shirt. That to me is an undershirt. It is not usually a turtleneck. A turtleneck, I mean, I know he's talking about like a cotton turtleneck that we all were wearing back in the 80s. And I mean, obviously I understand what a turtleneck is, but what he does is from the very beginning, he introduces it as this turtleneck undershirt. So it was very difficult for me, first of all, to picture that. And second of all, every time it came up, and it comes up a lot, and it actually is very symbolic in lots of ways, I was like, it's not an undershirt. And they do talk about it as a soupol, which is like it would go under a sweater. But what that would be like a normal turtleneck, like a cotton turtleneck that you would wear underneath, a sweater that was going to be scratchy for you. So it was a little bit frustrating for me. And we have, I want to read a sentence of it just to give you a sense of sort of how this idea of the turtleneck undershirt really jumps out. They had erupted into my life without my noticing, and then it was too late. Those fateful turtleneck undershirts had gotten hold of, had flung themselves onto my existence, and I no longer knew the feeling of the wind on the back of my neck. So the other issue here is that this idea of them flinging themselves onto him, in the French, the subject of this sentence is not, in fact, this turtleneck undershirt that is flinging itself at him. What it is the unavoidability of the turtleneck, or this undershirt, that has the higher collar, which is the soupol, which is S-O-U, meaning under, and P-U-L-L, meaning under a sweater. So in the French version, it's like the inevitability of the turtleneck that he is fighting against. And he talks about fighting against it and how it erupted into his life. But here, what happens with Ben Truman is the turtlenecks become the subject of the sentence. And it's very awkward when they flung themselves onto him. I was like, well, how is this being translated? So I looked at it and I was like, that's not even the subject of the sentence. And it also, the French verb is like seized me. It was the inevitability that seized him. It was not the turtleneck that flung itself upon him. So I wouldn't normally care, except that some of these translations in the English were honestly like strange enough that I was like, I gotta check this out. I gotta look at how the other guy did it, Lauren Stein, and then I gotta look at the original. Okay. The last translation element I want to look at is not actually so much a translation thing, it's just a difference in terms of the edition. So this is the edition of the French, and I really love its size. It's really it's like a tiny little book, which is sort of underscoring the fact that this is a novella. It's only 91 pages long in this version by McNally Jackson. But one thing that's very important in this edition that I don't see in the McNally Jackson, because it is not there, is the use of ephemera. So there are a bunch of different times in this little French volume where we will have a sort of a pulled out, like a square of text, or at the very end, we have like a photograph of the bottle of wine, and we have an excerpt that's actually like a copy of one of Sophie Cahl's, her part of her birthday art performance thing that she does. We also, at one point, have a newspaper announcement from Le Monde, the big French newspaper, about Ulysses, about that spaceship that is out in space and also has a very important role at the very end of the book. So we have these different incursions of real life into the novel, and I really loved them. The other thing that we don't have when we eliminate them is we don't have the little captions that are beneath them. So for example, when we have this little block of text here, underneath it, we have the following, and I'm going to have to translate it for myself. It's an extract from Rituel d'anniversaire, which is Sophie Cahl's big work, and it has the date, 1998. It's untranslated, and this chunk of text is in, the words themselves are in the book that was translated by Ben Truman, but for some reason, they decided not, in fact, to set the stuff apart, and they don't obviously then have these captions that I actually found very meaningful. You feel like you're reading a report. You feel like you're reading an account of something. And in many ways, this makes it feel like a much more true story. So it seems like it would have behooved them to include these. I really always love to just looking at other, handwriting from other people who do not speak English, or at least didn't grow up in the United States. So it's very fun to see, in fact, handwriting by Sophie Cahl, which is really a treat. And we get that here because we have these copies of this ephemera. I want to close today by looking at this one passage toward the very end of the novella. It's not quite the last page, but it really speaks, I think, to the entire book as a whole. So fiction might come to the aid and service and the rescue of reality, as if reality weren't always already a fiction. And I looked out the window at the road I had already traveled. I thought of all the events that had taken place all over the world, and all the beings and things, and of my wayward and basically lucky life. And we had arrived, and paying the fare in a currency that was no longer the same as before, I wondered what book might be lying on her bedside table. And at that moment, I was eager to find out. We also have this very kind of meta thing because he starts talking about writing a book at the same time that this Ulysses spacecraft is going up for its third voyage. So you have in many ways this kind of weaving together of lots of these different strands. And at the end, it is so satisfying the way that we really see all of these resonances with these literary echoes that we keep hearing, and especially the ones with Mrs. Dalloway. So thank you very much for tuning in. I really had such a good time really digging in to some of the real strengths of this novel and really enjoying this experience of autofiction. It's very rewarding in many ways to sort of play with the idea of what kind of a text it is that sort of straddles that line between fiction and autobiography. So thank you very much and happy reading.